Let me begin by saying that it's an enormous pleasure to be here to discuss these issues. What I'm going to do is simply conversationally present what you have on the outline that I think has gone around the room. I originally wrote this paper under the rubric, The Limits of Scientific Explanation, rather than under the exact title of the conference, but I do touch on mentalistic explanations and other things that have been of concern so far. Let me start with part one and very briefly simply mention some background points. I'm interested in explaining why, when I talk about a priori explanation and explanation in general, not explaining what. And I'm taking it that when we explain why something is the case, we presuppose that it is the case. But a question that arises in the theory of explanation is whether the explanans, the set of explaining propositions, must be true. I think if we're going to allow inference to the best explanation, we'll be presupposing that there are explanations that contain false propositions. So, although I'm not going to regiment, I will have in mind leaving open whether explaining materials have to be true, but my examples will involve cases in which both what is to be explained and what explains it are true or are the case. Now, I won't be talking about explaining as a linguistic activity, so I set aside the illocutionary use of explain. I will be interested in the connection between explanation and understanding. And a preliminary question is whether if you receive an explanation, you then have understanding. I think the answer is no, but if you comprehendingly grasp an explanation of why P, then you at least have the raw materials for understanding. Let me go to part two on a priori explanation, proof, and theoretical method. A priori explanation is not a standard term, and what I have in mind is explanation in which something a priori figures essentially, and we can say an explanation is wholly a priori if the explanans, the explaining material, the explanandum, what is to be explained if we think in terms of propositions, and the relation between the two are all a priori. Now, I think of the base case of the a priori as the self-evident, and as I understand a self-evident proposition, it's one that meets two conditions. First, adequately understanding it provides a basis for justification. It gives you justification for believing it, though it doesn't entail that you do believe it, even if you consider the proposition. Two, there's a connection to knowledge. If you believe that P, where it is self-evident, on the basis of an adequate understanding of it, then your belief constitutes knowledge. Now, we can talk about explanational knowledge, a priori or empirical, when someone knows why P is the case, so is in a position to say P because Q. If you're in a position to say that with knowledge, you know why P is the case, namely for the reason that Q. So I'm still really developing some preliminary ideas, but a question that arises now with this framework is whether if we conceive a priori proof epistemically, we then can talk about explanation that's a priori as providing a kind of a priori understanding. Now, proof can be understood in a purely formal sense, but if we take it epistemically, then I think we want to think of an a priori proof as proceeding, if we want a strong notion, from self-evident propositions, but more generously from a priori propositions. And now with these things before us, we can ask whether philosophy ever contains proofs of an a priori kind, which will yield some sort of a priori knowledge why the phenomenon that the proof concerns is the case. Maybe it won't be controversial that philosophers can prove negative theses a priori. What about the idea that knowledge is not constituted by justified true belief? Arguably, there are cases that are decisive, but some people think they aren't decisive, so there really is controversy here. I'll come to the question whether philosophy might have some a priori proofs of general positive propositions. That's harder, but I'm not sure we ought to give up. Now, a large concern of the project of which this conference is part is scientific explanation, its scope and its limits. So, is an a priori explanation scientific? Well, there's considerable unclarity about what constitutes a scientific proposition at all, so what constitutes a scientific explanation? I'd like to start by saying that we can take the terms scientific and unscientific to be contrary terms, and an a priori explanation is not unscientific. Let's think of it as non-scientific. Now, here we get a very large question that concerns the appeal of naturalism in the contemporary intellectual climate. Let's ask whether we should accept something that I think some philosophers presuppose or even argue for. I call it the assumption of the philosophical primacy of scientific method. Here you might think of Quine's influential essay, Epistemology Naturalized. I don't think Quine succeeded in naturalizing epistemology, but he encouraged people who wanted to go in that direction. He had, of course, a rather narrow conception of naturalization there. You might call it empiricization. He really was thinking that epistemology could be a branch of psychology, and he was thinking not just of continuity between philosophy and science as I do, but of philosophy proper, or anyway properly conducted, as a sort of branch of scientific inquiry. Now, I guess my first general thesis here is that there is something we might fruitfully call theoretical method. And both philosophical method in inquiring into philosophical issues and scientific method are cases of it. This is a method of building theories in relation to data, raising questions, hypothesizing, comparing and evaluating hypotheses in response to data. I think this is really quite familiar, but I believe it's very useful to think in terms of a method of theoretical inquiry shared between empirical science and philosophical investigations. You might wonder whether I'm really talking about reflective equilibrium. Well, there's an understanding of reflective equilibrium on which theoretical method involves seeking reflective equilibrium, but the search for reflective equilibrium could be much narrower. So I would say we are not talking about one and the same thing, but these notions are certainly best understood in relation to one another. Part 3, and I hope I'm not going too fast, but our time is short. Part 3 concerns a priori elements in empirical explanation. Now, let's take an empirical explanation to have at least one empirical proposition as or as essential in the explanans or explanandum, and we can talk about such explanations as being inductive or deductive. There was a time when some people thought that genuine explanations are deductive, and on that count you could think that only if the connection between explanans and explanandum is one of entailment, only then do you have a real explanation. So you'd have an a priori element in that entailment in any explanation, empirical or other. I'm ready to countenance inductive explanations, and I want to suggest that we might have an explanation of an empirical phenomenon that involves an a priori principle. So let's take one that's plausible epistemologically. Roughly, we might say, beliefs held on the basis of clear visual experience are prima facie justified, meaning there's something to be said for them in terms of justification. They'd be defeasibly justified, but nonetheless, there'd be something that counts for them. Now, imagine we're taking a walk in a meadow with someone who says, oh, look at that pair of stumps in the distance. We're puzzled because we see just one stump. Well, this person has double vision, and let's suppose doesn't know it, has no reason to suspect it. So the person has a clear and steadfast visual experience as of two stumps, and in virtue of that has prima facie justification for believing there are two stumps. So you ask, why on earth does he believe that when it's clear there's just one stump there? And the reply might be, well, she has double vision, and so it looks to her as though there are two stumps there. That explains why the belief is held and also why it has some level of justification. So we have here a deductive subsumption of a belief under a principle that is universal and a priori and takes one from visual experiences of a certain kind to prima facie justification. Now, let's come over to something closer to the topic of the conference, mentalistic explanation. Very commonly, we explain actions as performed in order to achieve something, and we might generalize, as some have, as follows. When a normal agent S wants something, on balance, wants it more than anything incompatible, for instance, has the ability and the opportunity to A, some action, and believes that A-ing is required to achieve the thing wanted, then the person A's. This is, of course, a generalization of folk psychology. You could argue it's a priori, giving wide scope to ability and opportunity. I think if you want to argue it's a priori, it's better to put in S tends to A, and I have actually defended a tendency generalization of that kind, which I think is the generalization that governs a great deal of folk psychological explanation. So I think we have here something very interesting. It's a candidate for a priority, and yet it's a principle of folk psychology. It appears to be testable, but it isn't merely empirical in the sense that it's just an expression of some regularity we've noticed. The generalization is partly constitutive of the very concept of wanting. We could not really adequately explicate wanting, or I think intentional action, without something of this sort. So it turns out that we have here a phenomenon that it's very difficult to classify. You have something that appears to be testable, appears to ground inductive nomological explanations, and yet it's partly constitutive of some concept. So it plays a conceptual role, and from that point of view, you might argue it's a priori, but it plays an empirical role, even having some predictive power, and from that point of view, you want to treat it as a testable psychological generalization. So I'm really suggesting that it isn't so easy to make a sharp division between principles usable in explaining empirical phenomena, explaining why they occur, in fact, and principles that are conceptual in some sense of interest to philosophers. So here's one way of seeing the need for cooperation between philosophers and psychologists in understanding not only human action, but the sorts of concepts we use in explaining human action. Part 4 has to do with explanation and understanding. I've suggested that if you receive an explanation of why something's the case, you have the materials for understanding why it's the case. You have a basis for understanding, even if you don't actually understand. Now, we can contrast explicit and structural understanding. I don't think I'll go into that given the press of time, but let me illustrate some elements that figure in some very basic kinds of explanation. One case is the typical subsumptive case in which I talk about categoriality. Here's a simple example. Why did G, a gas, expand? Well, it expanded over interval I because gases expand when heated, and it was heated over interval I. So we've subsumed the phenomenon to be explained under a generality. We've put it into a category. That kind of explanation is very intuitive. And I would speculate, here Professor Swinburne is probably our resident expert, that categoriality is connected, interestingly, with simplicity. Now, there's something else that I want to point out, maybe a little less emphasized or even less familiar in thinking about these matters. I call it thinkability, which is a term for the possibility, relative to a given kind of being, of getting something before the mind. Now, with a very simple intuitive explanation, we can get before the mind at a given time the corresponding conditional of an explanation. That's the conditional whose if clause contains the explanans and whose then clause contains the explanandum. So you can get before your mind this conditional. If G is an expanding gas, is a gas, and it is heated over interval I, then it expands over interval I. Now, why is thinkability so important? Well, I would speculate that, at least for beings like us, what cannot be thought, in the sense that it can be gotten before the mind, can't be believed, and so can't be known. So the connection between explanation and between understanding and knowing why is secured in a certain way by a thinkability requirement, and what doesn't meet the requirement is problematic from the point of view of the epistemology of the relevant kind of justification. I would say then that thinkability, the capacity to get the explaining materials before the mind, so to speak, at a mental glance, is another element in simplicity, though there's a lot more to that elusive notion than thinkability and categoriality. Now, what about normative propositions as part of the picture here and as giving us a domain in which we have explanations that are not unscientific but non-scientific? Take Kant's categorical imperative in the humanity formula and abstract from the imperatival formulation Kant gave it and formulate it like this. An act is right if and only if it treats everyone concerned as an end and no one concerned merely as a means. Let's just suppose that's close to the intention. Well, could we, taking that as a priori explain why lying is prima facie wrong? That lying is prima facie wrong, not necessarily wrong on balance, is crucial for an intuitionist ethic like that of W.D. Ross and many others. And it seems to me that you could say lying fails to treat the person lied to as an end, and hence is prima facie wrong under this imperative. And you get categoriality and a quite simple explanation. Now, is the humanity formula self-evident? Well, I wouldn't say so, but it could be a priori in the sense that it's provable from self-evident materials by self-evident steps. It's not clear that Kant didn't think it was provable a priori. The connection between it and the veracity principle is arguably a priori. I think you have to do regimentation to get a real deduction here, but you can do that. So at least it seems possible that we can find something normative and in terms of it explain something else that's normative and less general. I think we can do the same kind of thing for epistemology, as a matter of fact. I simply took an example from ethical theory as more likely to make the point perspicuous. Now, would we have here a case of a priori philosophical explanation of something quite general and quite positive? I think arguably we would. We'd have something in moral philosophy in which we can argue we begin with something a priori and we derive something a priori. And note, too, that what we have derived can still be self-evident. If you look at my characterization of the self-evident, it does not entail that the self-evident is unprovable. And that goes against many writers in the epistemological tradition, certainly including Moore, Pritchard, Ross, who I think failed to see the possible integration between their intuitionism and Kantian theory and other general theories because they thought the self-evident is unprovable. I have a section on explanatory ultimacy and grounding, and I don't think we need to go into that, though if anyone wants to, we can. I think in the interest of time, I'd rather wrap up and see what you'd like to discuss. So let me just say by way of conclusion, I have tried to get scientific explanation in a fruitful comparative relation to philosophical explanation, both having an important relation to understanding, both having a role in what I call theoretical method, of which I think scientific method and philosophical method are special cases. So I'm making room for important continuity between empirical and a priori inquiry without washing out an important distinction between the two. I'm also, as you see, suggesting that reason in the form of reflection on conceptual matters has substantive power. So by contrast with Hume, who thought that what we know by reason is only the analytic, and lots of empiricists, of course, take that classical empiricist view, I'm holding that the a priori can be substantive and rather important. I gave you an example of an epistemic principle, a visual experience principle, gave you a couple of examples from the moral domain. So as I see it, philosophy, as reflection on all these questions, is indispensable. I hope I've illustrated that in some small way here. Thank you.